Today is Remembrance Sunday. It's a day when we remember the sacrifices of servicemen and women and civilians killed in wartime. Today's younger generation tends to get its information and history on Britain's World War II Blitz from films, books and television. It's a history that tends to refer mostly to the bombing of London, of Coventry, of Portsmouth, Plymouth and other damaged English towns. It's sometimes forgotten that there was another Blitz in Britain that wiped out whole neighbourhoods, whole families, and nearly crippled one of the country's most important centres of war production, the Blitz on Glasgow and Clydebank. That Glasgow and Clydebank would be a target for the Luftwaffe should not have been a surprise, for her industry had fuelled the fires of the British Empire for many years, in peace and war. War always brought boom to Glasgow and Clydebank, whether it was imperial problems with the Boers or problems nearer home in the Kaiser's War. Then factories like Singer's turned from sewing machines to ammunition. Shells of all calibers were spun by lasses only recently housemaids or skivvies. The big guns and howitzers that fired the shells on the Western Front and other places on the road to the big picnic were forged at Dalmuir and Parkhead, but not fast enough. And when industrial action threatened, the troublemakers were deported to Edinburgh. The English establishment certainly knew how to punish a Glaswegian. Whether it was the mighty dreadnoughts that kept the German Navy in port for most of the war, or the new fearsome ships of the land that surprised them at Cambrai, they were made in Glasgow. The contribution of industry along the Clyde cannot be underestimated. Even in the new battlefield of the air, over 1,000 fighter and bomber planes were built by the skilled hands of Clydebank's workforce. Post-war there was turmoil, rent strikes and growing support for a new Soviet Union, born out of civil war, but well represented in Glasgow, boasting the country's first Soviet consul. Singers across the river were not so pleased as their assets in the new republic were confiscated and their Russian market dried up. The Clyde slouched towards slump. Innovatory companies like Beardmore's tried to turn the success of the wartime Zeppelins into peacetime profit, but prospects were irrevocably damaged by disasters. Unemployment reached 30%, 90,000 in Glasgow alone. Even Project H34, the Queen Mary, being built at John Brown's, was stopped when money ran out. When work restarted thanks to a government handout, the Prince of Wales came to see her and scandalised all the bigwigs by afterwards demanding a tour around Glasgow's slums and asking, how can a civilization such as ours produce such magnificence of the Queen Mary and tolerate at the same time such housing conditions? Glasgow's slums were the worst in the developed world, and although surrounded by some of the most beautiful countryside in the world, Clydesiders could rarely afford to visit it. Elsewhere, fascism was on the march. With a confidence born out of nationalistic fervour, Hitler marched his troops into the Rhineland, openly breaching the Treaty of Versailles, signed after defeat in World War I. When nothing was done, he annexed Austria, then turned his attention on Czechoslovakia. But there was to be peace in our time. A peace, however, bought at the expense of the Czechs, betrayed even before the concrete on their newly constructed defences had time to set. But in truth the penny had dropped. Appeasement went hand in glove with rearmament, and Glasgow's military order books began to fill as war clouds gathered. Even before war was declared, an evacuation plan was set in motion by Glasgow Corporation. 170,000 children went from major Scottish cities. Town met country. The Gorbals met rural Idle.
We went to this little town called Kilbarkin, a little country town, maybe about population of about 200, I think. We were in a farm. We had about 2.5 miles to walk to school every day. That way and back, 2.5 miles both ways. And we did that. We were living there for about 2 years. And for some reason, when I fell out with the lady at the house, her and I had a confrontation, and I ran away. So I ran away, but the unfortunate part was I had my sisters with me. They were staying at the same house. I told them I was going to run away, and they wanted to come with me. So we ended up going away this day, and we were off school. I think it was a school holiday. And I said, I'm going away on that day. Anyway, they came with me. But we only had 1 and sixpence. So we were on the bus, and I said to the bus conductor, I want to go as far as this 1 and sixpence will take us. So he went as far as the next policeman.
When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, treaty-bound but still ill-prepared, Britain dutifully declared war. Another evacuation was begun, that of German and Italian aliens, many of whom had lived in Glasgow and other Scottish cities for generations. Hundreds were killed when the Andorra Star transporting them to Canada was torpedoed. The submarine stranglehold around Britain tightened.
New Year's Day is this week. How about some good resolutions? I wonder. Well, why not resolve something you'll like? Save on bread, eat potatoes instead.
I mean, you were rationed. You made 2 ounces of cheese and 2 ounces of sugar, an ounce of butter. You had a ration book with what you were allowed to get.
Everything was in short supply. Women joined the land army to release farm workers for military service. There was skepticism at first. It was hard, physical work, a man's job, some would say. But many a city lass proved her worth over the war years, be it harrowing, pea-picking, milking, or even ploughing. As in the fields, so it was on the factory floor, as military production was stepped up to maximum. The air war demanded engines, and the new Rolls-Royce factory was built at Hillingdon, employing in the end nearly 30,000 workers, men and women.
Oh, the girls in the machine shop, you need to see them to believe it. Fantastic, fantastic. They're billing their hands around as if they've been born into it. They're really magic. They were easy to train. As I said, they didn't take any quick roads. They done the job as it should be done.
Female conscription in Britain was only surpassed by that of the Soviet Union. And not only did women help make thousands of barrage balloons at Kelvin Hall, but they helped to fly them too. But still the predicted onslaught from the skies did not come. It was a phony war, but not for long. As the British Expeditionary Force returned to the homeland bedraggled and beaten, in a gesture of support to their allies, the 51st Highland Division was sent to France under French command, only then to be cut off at Valery-en-Court and marched into captivity. Then there was the propaganda war as the German black radio station, Radio Caledonia, came on air to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, with a very Scottish-sounding announcer promising a separate peace for Scotland. On the other hand, the so-called New British Broadcasting Station warned that Glasgow was to be a strategic target for the Luftwaffe, and Glasgow believed them.
We started filling sandbags right away. And during the week, some of us kept filling sandbags. Another portion of the men who was probably older and went down to some of the places in Glasgow, building the sandbags round important buildings.
The biggest fear then was gas. Local authorities were compelled to organise gas attack simulation. 38 million gas masks were issued. There was even a mask for the smallest baby, and gas mask drill was put firmly at the top of the school curriculum, as these boys and girls of Knightswood Primary School demonstrated for the cameras. But then if it wasn't gas, high explosives and incendiaries would be used, and Glasgow's tenements, home to a very high proportion of the population, were vulnerable. Initially, the authorities could do little more than sandbag the entrances against blast, but eventually the sandbags were replaced with brickwork, and communal shelters were constructed. And while the bairns reenacted battles of the past, their elder brothers and granddads practiced for real in the local defence volunteers, or look, duck and vanish, as they were unkindly called, before they became the Home Guard. But at least the Germans took them seriously, warning by radio that they would have no military status if caught and would be shot as terrorists. Invasion was a very real threat.
Hitler planned to drop a parachute division on the Clyde to join up with the 8th Panzers, whose job it would have been to thrust up through Western England to the north and then to the west of Scotland. If such a blitzkrieg had been successful, and it had been successful in Europe, they would have been followed by Dr. Alfred Six's Gestapo. He'd been appointed head of that organisation in post-invasion Britain. The Gestapo planned a headquarters in Glasgow, probably here. Imagine the swastika flying over the Mitchell Library. The usual programme would have followed: arrest, interrogation, torture, and execution for any resistance. The Gestapo expected to be more than unusually busy in the west of Scotland.
This was a people's war. Everyone was involved. Even Glasgow's Boy Scouts had a role to play and trained for the transporting of the injured in the aftermath of aerial attack. But still, the bombers did not come. There was speculation and myth. The west of Scotland had freak air pockets above it. It was too mountainous, and the rocks were magnetic, causing navigation problems. They should have told the Lufthansa pilots, who had been photographing the area since the 1930s, identifying potential targets. But the most interesting theory was that the Germans thought that if Glasgow was left alone, it would initiate its own social revolution right along the Clyde. At first it was all quiet. There were, however, a number of firsts. The first enemy plane to be shot down over Britain was by the City of Glasgow RAF Squadron. The first bomb to fall on Britain. It killed a Scottish rabbit, and the first person to be killed on the mainland was a Scot. But generally, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above England, Scotland suffered only brief incursions from the Luftwaffe.
We moved to a billet in Blackheath in London, where we started bomb disposal company. That Blackheath, we were up the top of Maze Hill. Clyde House was the name of the building we were in, where we lifted quite a lot of bombs. And at the beginning of December, 2 sections went to the Twickenham rugby ground, where there were 13 bombs landed on the one night. And the company I was in manned 12. But unfortunately, there was one left, which was the 13th, which turned out to be unfortunate for the company that came in to cover that bomb, because they were all killed.
If you were off duty and in bed, it used to be an awful bind to have to get up and go to the air raid shelter, and you used to try to stay in bed, but one of the sisters used to come round and hammer on the door and open it, make sure you were up and down in the shelter. And we used to think it was an awful pest to have to get up out of bed.
I never thought the Blitz would come to Glasgow.
By September 1940, the aerial duel had been decided. The planned invasion was postponed and the Luftwaffe changed tactics. In that month, Glasgow was attacked and George Street was hit. Also hit was HMS Sussex, moored on the Clyde. She had a lucky escape when a bomb penetrated her deck, narrowly failing to detonate her magazine, which was full as she was prepared for sea operations. It had been a small-scale raid, but Glasgow and Clydebank's emergency committees stepped up training and thought to visit the English cities of Coventry, Manchester, Sheffield and Hull, which had already endured the worst.
Any sense of security felt as these English cities were laid waste and Glasgow and the Clyde were left untouched proved to be dangerously false. As the spring of 1941 brought good weather and moonlight, the Luftwaffe proved that it had no reservations about blitzing the Clyde, political or otherwise. To find the Clyde, they used their revolutionary navigation and bomb-aiming devices, Weiverfahren and Knickebein. These involved the projection of radio waves out from the continent. When they arrived at the target area, they discovered that they could bomb visually because the moonlight was reflected in the Clyde. And then there were the 100 fires raised by the first waves to guide the following squadrons.
Oberleutnant Otto Wolf, a Heinkel 111 navigator, later to be killed on the Polish frontier, left a brief note in his journal. He was just 20, about the average age of the Luftwaffe crews.
Wir starten von Halbu Richtung Glasgow, die Werften. Es ist eine helle, mondbeschienene Nacht. Bald sind wir über Schottland. Die 1000 Kilometer sind schnell vorübergegangen. Glasgow steht schon in Flammen. Wir können die Straßen bis hinunter zum Fluss sehen. Zu unserer Rechten explodieren Öltanks. Wir benutzen den automatischen Bombenabwurf nicht, sondern klinken unsere Bomben manuell aus. Ein Suchscheinwerfer erfasst uns. Ich denke an meine Mutter. Alle wirken nervös. Zum Glück gibt es wenig Flak und keine Anzeichen von feindlichen Jägern. Wir werden exzellente Resultate melden.
I lived in Old Kilpatrick, which is 3 miles from Clydebank, but that's where the oil tanks were. And when they bombed Clydebank, naturally they bombed Old Kilpatrick. It was a beautiful night in the 13th of March, a beautiful moonlight night. It had been a lovely day. My dad came in from his work and he said to us, you know, all the men in the shipyard are saying, this is the night we're going to get it. Well, we poo-hooed the idea.
Word came around an air raid. We had to go downstairs to where they had propped up the basement with big steel beams in order to support the building if it fell, and we duly went in there just laughing and talking, and as you would expect. Not the least bit worried and bored to tears, because in these days you worked all day and you studied at night, so to lose a night doing nothing was not a bonus, and we were all talking about nipping up to the pub for a pint. But we didn't, and eventually I said, "Och, to blazes, I'm away home. It's obviously just the usual nonsense and nothing will happen." So I left and I went onto the main road, got a bus, and we got on the bus. It was very quiet, but you could feel a difference at that time. You knew right away something was different.
We were trying to get home,
The bombs were just starting to fall then, I remember, but we managed to get down to Waterloo Street, where we got the bus down to Clydebank. And in those days, of course, the buses were all blacked out, and the conductors had to shout out the stops for you. And when we came down where we should get off at Whitecrook Street, we got off the bus, and the bombs were really coming down. Quite the thing then, quite frightening actually, noise and confusion. However, we crossed the road, meaning to get home naturally. A cup of tea was on our minds, but the policeman stopped us, said, sorry, can't go any further. And so we had to go into a shelter just at the beginning of Whitecrook Street off the main Glasgow Road in Clydebank. And in we went to this shelter, and there were hundreds of other people there too.
We were having a cup of tea when the sirens went, and this man owned the big house that we stayed in. He came down and he said, "You're a lot of cowards, come out and see the lovely searchlight display." And he walked out with his dog, and he was never seen again. He was killed instantly. And the air raid wardens came and told us that we had to get out, you know, and there was this terrible explosion. The whole place shook. And when we got out to go up to the local school, we had to go up there to stay for the night, the building at the corner of Queen Margaret Road had a landmine. It was a direct hit. And I was only a child, I was terrified, but I could hear the people screaming.
Glasgow's tenements collapsed into piles of smoking rubble. Her ancient university was hit. Cascadden Hospital, Parkhead School, and whole streets in Burnside, Scottstown, and Rutherglen burned under the cascade of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Scenes in Clydebank were chaotic. The emergency services were overwhelmed. No amount of training could have prepared them for the task they faced. Local fire brigades, assisted by auxiliary fire service volunteers, did what they could, hindered by rubble, burst mains, and in some cases the fact that their own stations had already been hit. All-consuming firestorms raged uncontrollably. Burning spirit from the whiskey distillery at Yoka ran through the gutters. Singer's factory, Beardmore's, and other industrial plants were razed to the ground or badly damaged.
We lay in the wood, spread ourselves out inside the wood till the all clear went in the morning, and then we moved on, making our way into Clydebank, where on the way there was a double-deck bus in a crater where we had partly to fill it in a wee bit after checking there were no one in the bus. And we moved on to Clydebank, and we spread ourselves out, so many at the Beatty's biscuit factory and some at Singer's sewing machine. But during the time we managed to save one or two kiddies' lives who was buried, and we could hear them crying. So we managed to get one or two out, but most of the people who did get out were dead.
We had a look out, and if you've ever or never been to hell, that was exactly what it looked like outside, because the oil had flown on, had flowed onto the canal, and the canal was on fire with the incendiary bombs. The streets were full of incendiary bombs, and it was just like looking out onto a fire. So we came back and we went into our places, with me with the quilt wrapped round me, and just about 6 o'clock, a bomb fell. We were just about the corner of this room from where we were, and somehow or other, my father just seemed to open up, and he managed to get out right away, and he drew the old man who was with him out too, and then, we were naturally buried, and they shouted to where we were, and lying under the rubble, all I had that I could move was my head. I was completely clamped down with rubbish, rubble, the bricks of the building, but I knew I could move my head and I could breathe, and these thoughts went through my mind, and I was able to shout to the wardens up above where I was, and gradually in time the wardens get down to me, and I was drawn out, and I had to loosen off my shoes to get out of the rubble.
We was using pick and shovel, but when we heard anyone crying, we actually dropped our pick or our shovel, whatever we had in our hand at that time, and started with our hands moving wood or timber, stone, whatever was in our way, trying to get to that little voice.
When daybreak came, a dazed population came out of their cellars and shelters to witness a scale of tragedy they had not dared to imagine. This was what was left of Kilbowie Road, Clydebank, with the area around Singer's factory and La Scala cinema completely flattened. The bombed-out and homeless survivors, like these on Radnor Street, queued for transport to evacuation centres. Thousands were homeless, hungry, shocked and traumatised. Many simply salvaged what they could and trekked to camp out in the hills. Visions of death were unavoidable. Whole families had been wiped out. 131 dead in Jellicoe Street. 50 members of the Rock family perished. 43 dead in Pattison Street. 27 in Napier Street. 20 in Glasgow Road. 23 in Radnor Street. 9 from the Richmond family.
Coming near Yoker, near Red Warden, stopped us and asked us where we were going. And I told him we're going to Yoker. Well, he says, I advise you not to go there. So down at Yarrows, there a landmine struck an air raid shelter, and I believe over 300 killed in it.
I think which is so different from probably fighting a war, if you're shelling from an aeroplane, you don't come across the people that are getting killed, but there not only were you coming across the people that were getting killed, but there were people who you knew. In fact, there was a chap who we would call nowadays a headbanger, a sort of kind-hearted fellow, but not maybe just full of all the sort of brains that he should have. But that was the chap who came in, and he was only superficially cut in that, but he was not for staying. He was going back to do his duty, and he did, you know. So there was a good camaraderie. God, I didn't think after all these years it would affect me.
I think we all were a bit shocked when we looked about and saw the devastation round about us, and no wonder the policeman stopped us and said not to go up the road. But we did, and we found our way down to where our house was. We go down a wee lane, turned left into the wee lane, and there was our house, ablaze, absolutely. So this was early in the morning, and we knew that my father and sister were in the house, but we knew they must be, you know, either, well, they could have been killed for all we knew.
In Maryhill, 13 members of the McBride family were lost, a story only partially told by these gravestones in Lamb Hill Cemetery.
Your grandpa, they all called him Old McBride, and his wife, they were in the house. There were cousins in the house, there were daughter-in-laws in the house, there were the grandchildren in the house, and only 2 out of the lot was saved. Their ages ranged from 6 months up until about, say, 11. But my sister was ill for days after it, like, you know, because some was burnt, some had no heads, and, you know what I mean? But she still had to go and identify them. In fact, there was one child buried in an unknown grave. Oh, it was a turnout. The whole of Maryhill was just all on their own. Everybody was breaking their heart to see all the coffins all going by, small ones, large ones. The whole place was turned out in grief. The husband, when he did come home from the RAF, he came to stay with us. But he was a man that was demented, because after all, he lost his wife and all his children all in one night.
The Luftwaffe came again to the Clyde on Friday, and on Saturday getting nearer to one of their major targets, the Rolls-Royce works at Hillingdon. Anti-aircraft fire was light, but a heroic barrage was put up by a Polish destroyer under repair at John Brown's. 2 enemy aircraft were shot down. Clydebank lay in ruins. It was not service as usual. At the time, these shots were censored. The cinema-going audiences around Britain could not be shown the truth. It was simply too horrible, as body after body was removed from the rubble that was once a home. 80 people died here in 2nd Avenue, including 10 from the Diver family and 8 from the McSherrys.
Just as I got into the hospital, a bus arrived. This was what we call a 15 bus, and it was full of people who had been caught in a bomb at a school quite near the hospital called Bankhead. And it was an ARP centre, so there was quite a lot of casualties. And this bus had been passing when it happened, and they just shoved the folk in. How they got them in, we don't know, because we had to open the emergency door on the roof to get them out. And we started emptying them. There was a lot badly injured. There was some people I actually knew, and they were naturally shocked. But the two things I can always remember, which were probably the most in my mind, was the first casualty I took out the bus was a young boy of about 2 or 3 who I just lifted in my arms, and he was just lying as if he was asleep. But by the time I got him into the hospital, we found that in fact he was dead. And it's funny how it catches you. It was really a very, very timely experience, because I was only a young fella, 19, so this was something which really hit me then and still does, because I've got a grown-up family of my own now.
There were a lot of incendiaries, that's what did our house. They landed on the roof and there was no water. The fire brigade couldn't stretch their hoses over to the canal, so it was just left to burn. There was absolutely nothing they could do.
Round about 4:30 we went out and we waited and we waited. Ultimately, a bus came along and stopped, and we stood, and we still stood. Nobody moved. The bus driver got out, and he stood, and we said to each other, "What's the matter? We see people on the bus, but nothing's happening." They were too frightened to move, I think. So ultimately opened the door and the people came out. I have never seen anything like it. Some of them were black with soot where the bomb had blown the chimney out. Some of them were great slivers of glass in their arms, their necks, their legs. Some of them, their clothing was hanging off them. I've never seen a sight like it, and I'll never forget it.
This was Granville Street, Anderson shelters ripped apart by direct hits, and Melrose Street, where the timber garages around these cars had simply disappeared. The legendary Holy City overlooking Singers was no more. In Clydebank, only 8 houses from a stock of 12,000 remained undamaged. Nearly 4,500 were either completely destroyed or had to be demolished later. The situation in Glasgow was much the same, and although the scenes of death, destruction and despair were more dispersed, they remain vivid in the mind of artist Ian Fleming.
We went up and we passed this Dr. Warren's house, which was in Queen Margaret Drive, and his house was nearly flattened. And we found out afterwards that he had a shelter built in the house beneath stairs, and he had left his wife and children there, and he'd went to make a cup of tea, and his wife and children were killed, and he was spared, funny enough, you know. But it was terrible, you know, and hearing these people screaming in the fire, it was really terrible, you know. You were young, so you just took it that was normal, you know. You took it as normal.
I remember something else other than coming back to work again, because I was taking a chance that Hillington hadn't been hit, and I know that a lot of people, were 25,000 people working there, so I'm sure they didn't all run away, or they didn't all stay off work. I'm quite sure of that. They were nearly all there.
We went into Glasgow Station, Central Station. Here's this 5 kids, 2 mothers and fathers, and all looking very bedraggled and dirty. And we went into the Central Station, which was going as normal because half of Glasgow hadn't realised what had happened. And yet, being Glasgow, this gentleman, I can only use the term in its proper meaning, came up to my father and said, "Excuse me, sir, but was this bombed? Have you actually?" And my father said, "We have indeed." And he said, "Well," he said, "I am prepared to take you to my house immediately, because I certainly wouldn't let you walk about the way you are, you know." So my father thanked him, but I thought it was a nice Glasgow. You know, you only happen in Glasgow, that.
OK, they were an underground shelter, but it was covered in wood. And of course, if a bomb had landed there were no chance we would have got out, because the whole place would have been up in flames. So my father said, right, he says, if one's going, we're all going. So we all stayed at home.
So we went round the people asking them if there was anything they needed, anybody they wanted to get in touch with. But the main problem with them, and some of them, particularly the women, were crying because they said, "Only home to go back to." I said, "I know." And I said, "That's the worst part of it. My house had gone," said one of them. "Blown apart," said another one. So, and some of them were shaking uncontrollably. And you held them by the arms to stop the shaking, but even with that, they were still shaking.
When the BBC first reported the casualties of Glasgow and Clydebank's Blitz, it seemed as if there was a conspiracy to cover up the real effects of the raids. First there was understatement, and then there were inaccurate figures. Few people knew the true extent of death and injury until after the war. During the war, there were only approximations. It wasn't the 500 killed, as was first reported, but more like 1,200. There was a great deal of bitterness, some people even taking the view that this was English officialdom's casual attitude to Scotland's suffering. This scandal was further compounded when the Department of Health supervised the burial of 67 victims here at Delnota Cemetery. There were many heroes during the Glasgow and Clydebank Blitz. Here are just a few of them. Hugh Campbell, an ambulance driver, awarded the OBE. Mary Haldane, an ambulance attendant, awarded the OBE. David Logan and John Smith, from a rescue party, awarded the OBE. Police Constable Charles Hendry, OBE. Sergeant John MacLeod, George Medal. James Craig, George Medal. And John Stewart, George Medal. The next major attack on the Clyde was on the 7th and 8th of April. Those planes that reached Clydebank bombed ruins. But there was new damage done in Glasgow, where 4,000 people were made homeless, and 100 people were killed, and 70 injured. Once again, Rolls-Royce was attacked. But the real targets were Greenock and Dumbarton. The Luftwaffe sent over 200 planes, but only 100 made it. The rest bombed secondary targets lower down the Clyde, as well as Glasgow. There was even death and destruction here at Gretna, as this plaque commemorates, to the memory of all those people who lost their lives in the bombing of Gretna, 7th of April, 1941.
On the 6th and 7th of May, it was the turn of Gurrock, Dumbarton and Greenock. Over 300 planes joined the attack, leaving nearly 400 dead and many more injured. The scenes of devastation in Greenock were all too familiar. 1,000 houses destroyed, over 50% of the houses damaged, and many industrial installations hit, as badly damaged as many English cities. James Hall, the official war photographer in the area, had the grim task of recording the aftermath of the raids in Greenock.
When Nazi Germany turned to the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, Clyde's Blitz ordeal was to diminish. But before that, there was a very mysterious postscript. The Royal Observer Corps, on May the 10th, tracked a Messerschmitt 110 moving in fast from the North Sea. It flew over Scotland, out to sea, turned back again, and crashed at Bonnyton Farm, its pilot having bailed out before. He landed exactly here, behind Fleur's farm, where a ploughman, David MacLean, who lived in the cottage behind me, invited him in for a cup of tea. It was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. In hospital in Glasgow, where his Home Guard captors took him, he said he was here on a peace mission. He wanted to meet the Duke of Hamilton, a friend of Winston Churchill's. Was he carrying a separate peace offer to Britain so that Germany could concentrate on Russia? Whatever, he took his secret to the grave when he died, a convicted war criminal, in Spandau Prison, Germany, in 1987.
Locomotives are the key to victory. Production of a utility engine is now underway at a works in Scotland. RAF loco busting not only draws the lifeblood of enemy transport, it raises a problem for us when we invade Europe. Designers working to Ministry of Supply orders got out plans for an austerity locomotive for use first on British railways, then overseas with the invading armies. Working to an approved design for an engine to haul 700 tons, it was found that in steel castings alone, the weight was reduced from 21 tons to 4. No less important in times of manpower shortage, the design saves 6,000 man-hours on every engine made. Old Robert Lithgow, 70, has been with the firm 43 years, and even he isn't the veteran here. Thomas Alexander is 76 and started here 60 years ago when Backy was Portenson out. Tommy Puan comes from China near Chongqing. He wants to be able to make engines to beat the Japs. All sorts of jobs on austerity locomotives are done by girls. It was a memorable day at the works when the first engine was completely assembled. It has the standard British gauge, 4 foot 8.5, but it can be quickly adapted to run anywhere on the continent. No time was lost before stoking up for boiler tests. One reason why these locomotives can be made quickly is that they're not built primarily for speed. Heavy haulage between 30 and 40 miles an hour is all that's wanted. When locomotive number 1 rolled out of the works, the Minister of Supply, Sir Andrew Duncan, was on the footplate. He had good cause for satisfaction. While Britain can turn out locomotives in plenty, Fighter Command and the Red Armies are taking crippling toll of Nazi transport. It's good to know that when the second front is open, the Army will have all the engines it wants.
The tide of war had turned, and as the skies above Britain grew more inhospitable for the Luftwaffe, Glasgow and the communities along the Clyde recovered as best they could. Their bomb sites were tidied up, factories were repaired or rebuilt, communications and transport restored. War production rose as women worked as never before.
on Glasgow and the Clyde came to an end with one on the early spring night of March the 23rd, 1943. The raid was short and sharp, and there's still a legacy of it left here in what remains of Greek Thompson's once beautiful Queen's Park Church, the last building in Glasgow to be destroyed by Hitler's Luftwaffe, and one of the few remaining World War II bomb sites left in Western Europe. It could be, perhaps, a permanent monument to the region's disastrous wartime experience. But whatever Germany had meted out during the Blitz on the Clyde was repaid 100-fold by British and Allied bomber crews. Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, the Luftwaffe had sown the wind, but it was German civilians who were to reap the whirlwind.
Got her troubles and we've got her cares, but as long as we keep smiling through, there'll come a day when the clouds roll away and the sun will be shining anew. When they sound the last so clear, how happy my darling will be. When they turn up the lights and the dark lonely nights are only a memory, nevermore will be apart, always together, sweetheart, for the peace bells will ring and the whole world will sing when they sound the last so clear.
All winter was howling o'er moor or mountain, wild was the search on the dark rolling sea. When I met about daybreak a bonny young lassie, who asked me the road and the miles to Dundee. Said I, my young lassie,
Dundee's early history is shrouded in legends and myth, and its many claims to fame involve some of the most colourful characters of Scottish history. Not least is that William Wallace himself, while studying here as a young man in about the year 1290, struck his first blow for freedom against English oppression.
gave me her arm, and where did I speer for that lassie might be? She appeared like an angel in feature and form, as she walked by my side on the road to Dundee.